You just might be right, Mr. Just might be right, Mr. Just
All aboard the Psychonautilus. Welcome aboard, folks. This is the increasingly unrealistically titled Voyage the 16th, which is actually the 17th show. We'll not mention that from now on. We'll just carry on with this numbering system. I quite liked last week's 15.1th Voyage. I think that was... What are you looking for? Are you looking for gubbins? Oh my God, you just want everything off me, don't you? As you can tell, we have Sibes in the room. What else? You're never going to actually manage it, are you? You're just going to mutter in the background. So he's not actually on the show this week. He's just...
Very expensive Japanese hologram.
Yes.
So.
Yes, no, he doesn't really exist. He's a figment of our collective imagination.
Silent system.
No.
Don't expect any more. Have a good evening.
Yes, can we shut up now, or shall I actually move the mic to somewhere where people might be able to hear you? Right, okay, now shut up. I really have absolutely nothing at all to say tonight, so that's it. I want to close the mic now and play some music. Actually, no, I won't. But I haven't got a great... I've got loads of things. I've got things and stuff. But nothing really kind of planned or organised, which kind of reflects my internal state at the moment. If you got anything particularly from the last sort of, what we got now, 15, 16 Psychonautiluses, there's a lot to choose from there. Anything that kind of came up in those broadcasts that kind of pricked your ears up and you didn't quite catch or you didn't quite understand that you want to ask in the chat, feel free. So, anyway, right. Mahatma, well done. Just a superb piece of synchronicity there. Look at that. Mahatma asked for me to describe, to give my explanation of persistent contrails, though he insists on using the other term in the chat. We might have to convert you from that one. Yeah, we were literally just discussing this off air a few minutes before we come to it. That I may well discuss it. Yeah, and I was actually on a call with our new host Aid a couple of weeks ago, a week or so ago, discussing this very topic with him then. So yeah, I suppose it's prudent that I should cover it. Essentially, I don't see any meaningful supporting evidence for the allegations of the sort of anti-chemtrail activists and ideologues. And having not found any supporting evidence, I began to consider an alternative explanation, because it's quite clear that aeroplanes now do not leave wispy trails that follow them across the sky and vanish really almost as quickly as they appear. Nowadays, a plane goes across the sky and not always, but sometimes, leaves a clear, persistent contrail that hangs in the sky long after the plane has disappeared, and effectively doesn't dissipate like the old contrails used to, but in fact sort of smears out across the sky and becomes a sort of a grey haze. Well, it occurred to me that in my misspent youth in Essex, I used to work at a garage where we would pack all the cars inside at night before we'd head off and close up, and consequently have to extract them packed in like sardines every morning. And when the weather was cold in the late 1970s, early 1980s, you really needed a car to have been running for a few minutes before you dared move it, or it would just stall out and misbehave and whatnot. So the procedure was to go in and open the the back doors up and start a few of the cars nearest to the door, and then sort of work your way out, pulling out cars one at a time, and starting up other ones as you sort of clear the backlog. Now, this site in particular, the garage, was right down in the bottom of a valley and was literally at sort of river level of the river that ran through Harold Wood, the Ingerbourne, I think it was. And on this one particular morning, I was working at this place for 8 years, so these were really exceptional air conditions. It was a particularly bitter morning, and we did our usual procedure of trying to extract the cars from the workshop. And by the time we'd got sort of half of the cars out, the entire workshop had filled with this dense, hanging fog. And by the time we had all of the cars out, it was literally, you couldn't work in there. We were having to use the sort of paraffin blast heaters to clear a working space where we could actually see what the bloody hell we were doing. And the bizarre thing about this fog was that you'd often get, a condensation build-up with pulling so many cars out of a confined space, especially when it was cold. But this particular occasion, it never went away. It stayed till about 11 o'clock in the morning. There were still wisps of it hanging around in the sort of rafters and sort of loitering between the unmoved cars till ridiculously late in the day. And this occurs to me as being a very similar sort of situation to this persistent contrail issue. So we're probably looking at a combination of exhaust pollutants, let's call them. You've got the gases, but you've also got various sort of carbon particulates and things like that in the soot of in the output of a car exhaust. And any sort of particulates is going to create what's known as nucleation sites, that when an ice crystal forms in distilled water, it's almost impossible to form individual ice crystals. It just forms as a solid block. This is why they use carefully distilled water and deoxygenated water for these ice sculpture blocks of ice that they use. And so it's basically optically clear ice instead of being white like ice would normally be. And so consequently I began looking into jet fuel additives, and sadly I can't give any links to the sites that I found when I first went looking, because they have either been deprioritised from the Google search and are buried several thousand pages deep now, or those websites have been realised for the sort of disclosure that they appeared to be giving and have been taken out of the public domain. But essentially these were websites for large jet fuel companies. I think it may have been Texaco, and I can't remember another one, but another one was like a lab, a sort of fuels research lab. And anyway, it was 3 or 4 different websites that I managed to find, all referring to nano fuel additives, jet fuel additives. And essentially the blurb was all singing the praises of these things, telling you how much more air miles you were going to get for your sort of ton of jet fuel, and how much longer your engines were going to be able to go in between vital sort of servicing. But the list of elements that some of these websites gave as being these additives, these fuel additives, were the very same sort of odd chemicals that appear to be turning up in things like mountaintop snow deposits and rainfall, which is what the sort of chemtrail brigade are claiming as being evidence for a sort of Agenda 21-esque depopulation effort. Now, I grew up in the 70s under the East London flight path, specifically under the East London stacking zone, where they would have sort of towers of circling planes held for arrival or departure from a particular air zone. Sort of pre-computerization, there was a lot more delays. And so consequently, I sort of spent an awful lot of time as a child laying on my back, looking in the sky, watching these planes creating their contrails and watching them disappear. And even back then, there would be odd days where the contrails wouldn't go away like they normally did. Often not with the local flights so much, but you would see the big, high altitude transcontinental flights going over sort of several thousand feet, probably 10,000 feet above the London stack. And they would often leave, you know what I mean, a contrail right the way across the sky that would take hours to clear and would sort of drift slowly across the sort of clear blue sky. But nothing like what we get today with the sort of hazy mist rather than anything approaching a clear blue sky. Anyway, it occurred to me that perhaps it was the revolution in engine design, in jet engine design, that has occurred in the interim. And certainly there was nothing, it was a definite boiling frog situation, that it wasn't until the skies were filled with persistent contrails that it even became evident that persistent contrails were a thing. And so when I sort of became aware of it and started paying attention to it, I don't know, but I would suspect that the reports and the prevalence of them came in the sort of mid to late 80s. And around that time, we see an absolute revolution being undertaken by the jet engine industry. That prior to that sort of date, all jet engines were of a single internal combustion design with... Oh, what's that? There's more planes now. What the fuck's that?
Well, there's more planes now, isn't there?
Oh, right.
There's more than following the same flight path.
There certainly is that. The plane density has increased, but certainly, prior to the mid 80s, we have the ordinary basic jet engine design with the turbine inside the venturi, and them basically sucking air in at the front and blowing out air and flames at the back. And around the mid-80s, we see the conversion to the modern turbofan engines. Well, the primary difference between the original type of jet engines and the modern turbofan engines is that you now have the original jet engine housed in the centre of a much larger engine nacelle, and that the big fan that you see on the front isn't actually the front of the jet turbine fan. That is literally just an impeller, basically a propeller on the front, an impeller, in fact. And that this has the effect of, because it's bolted to the front of the jet engine and spun up to very high speeds, it has the effect of sucking enormous quantities of air into the engine, and because obviously the combustion doesn't need any more air than it was already getting originally, because the combustion mixture is a predetermined ratio, that this additional air is now funneled down another venturi around the outside of the main jet engine, primarily to cool it. But effectively, this works like a vacuum cleaner effect, that it's sucking at the front and it's blowing at the back. However, the outlet from this compressor stage, this unignited sort of just compressed air stage, it goes through a venturi, which is a narrowing shaft, a narrowing tube, which both raises the airspeed and lowers the pressure. Well, in lowering the pressure, you have a vapor point effect over the moisture in the air, and then when it's released out the back, it's suddenly decompressed in a sort of 1,000-degree hot air plume coming from the jet. potentially with these the remnants of these nanoparticle sort of rare earth mineral and metal additives, creating the nucleation site, and now suddenly you have this sort of decompression zone. Now they have decompression tanks for preventing the bends for deep water divers, and if you suddenly decompress one of those tanks while it's pressurized, the first thing that happens is the whole thing fogs up, that the moisture in the air suddenly reaches a vapor point that's way below what it was previously at the pressure that it was at, and it just simply comes out of solution in the air and becomes a fog. Well, if that happens up at, say, 25,000 feet, well, we're talking minus 30 degrees. So we have this sort of rapid nucleation sites being created by the particulates of the exhaust. We have this compression and decompression of vast quantities of airflow with a huge water load in the intake and outlet of the jet engine. And it's my suggestion, my postulation, that what's actually happening is that the combination of all of these effects is creating a situation where these fogs are produced, which instantly freeze, and because of the nanonucleation sites being supplied by these nanoparticles. And the thing with nanoparticles is that they have very different chemical properties to the normal particles. They have a relatively huge reactive surface compared to their internal volume, compared with the normal molecule or clump of atoms of a given element. And the consequence is that you're going to get very different water properties, both at the pressures, the altitudes, and the temperatures that are up there. And that what's happening is that instead of frosted white ice crystals being formed, which would then be almost immediately melted by the sun, which was the case with the old contrails, we're now getting perfectly clear, optically transparent ice crystals forming. And what these are going to do is they are going to collect and scatter the ambient light in the sky, which is why we see them as white from the ground, because they're taking the ambient light and scattering it in all directions. And the other thing is that because they're transparent, the sun can't heat them up, and so they hang around. And that this has possibly been supported by some of my observations since, where I've seen what appear to be sort of heat waves in the sky. The atmosphere isn't made up of a sort of single uniform layer of air. There are multiple different boundary layers between the hot and cold air as you go up into the atmosphere. And often these boundaries between hot and cold air would look, if you could see them, more or less like the surface of an ocean with waves travelling across. And I have seen quite frequently persistent contrails being left by successive planes on a flight path in a clear blue sky, and they all stop at a certain point in the sky, in a line in the sky, and then all restart again sort of a mile or so later, as the plane's travelling through the colder air that's allowing it to leave the contrail, and then travelling through a bulge of warm air that stops the contrail from forming, and then re-entering the cold air, it starts to leave the contrail. And you get repeated planes all within a few miles of each other, all just leaving this gap of contrails in the sky where the atmospheric conditions are different. Now, this doesn't mean that this isn't something that we should be bloody campaigning about, because I've got a lux meter here, and I can go out here in central London and point my lux meter at the sky on any given morning and take a light reading. Now, in any natural situation, the light levels are low in the morning and in the evening, and increase to a solar maximum at midday. Well, that doesn't happen in London anymore. solar maximum comes at about 10:30, 11 a.m. And by then the sort of flight paths are absolutely crammed full. And by midday, you've lost nearly a third of the available solar radiation. Well, London's a bit of an extreme, bloody telephone. London may be a bit of an extreme example with the level of light loss that we're experiencing, but if that can be extrapolated out across the country, even in a fairly moderate percentage, then essentially whatever that percentage of light loss is, that's how much crop the farmers aren't going to be growing. Now, if nobody else, I would think that large-scale agrochemical farmers are going to be pretty up in arms, because most of them only run on profits of 5 or 10% on an entire year's harvest. So if they're losing 5% to solar radiation emission levels being cut by cheap air flights and their drive for ever greater air flight efficiency, which is actually what it looks like this is. And this, again, is another reason why it would appear that the mainstream, won't touch this with a barge pole because chemtrails is nonsense and can patently be pretty much shown to be, but that also, perhaps, this is known information within the mainstream, that perhaps they know that there's a reason why this is being caused, and it's being caused by our desire for convenience and cheap international flights, and that suits the air companies and the petrochemical companies very nicely, thank you very much. So, who knows? Anyway, that's Chemtrail 101. You can all stop using that stupid term now and start using persistent contrails and start talking to people about this, about whom this might actually have an impact and might have some rationale and provability. I mean, you can get light meter apps for your phone. You can get free ones. I wouldn't bother with those personally. I'd get sort of the £1.50 ones that you can get quite cheaply. Just do the experiments for yourself and you will see that solar radiation levels drop off towards midday and remain low until late in the evening. And so essentially we are only getting a proportion of the natural sunlight that we should be receiving prior to the airways being populated by our disappearing off to the Costa del Sol and all of those fabulous places that people do love going to, and I've never even been in the remotest interested in going. Anyway, I'll probably list the number of flights that I've taken in my life on the fingers of my hands. I think it's significantly less than 10, but some of those in planes with propellers. Yeah, I'm that old. Alright, okay, we're just checking back into the chat and I can see that Mahatma's not having any of it. It's definitely geoengineering, it's definitely the Agenda 21 depopulation, because they're not on flight paths. So I'd say that, you know what I mean, the stuff that's not on official flight paths is probably just going to be military, and there's going to be a shit ton of that over Wales. So it's hardly surprising that you're seeing that in Wales. As far as the geometric shapes, I kind of see that, but again, if you look at the satellite of the flight paths over Britain, you get an awful lot of crisscrossing of flight paths. And what generally happens with a flight path is it's not like a road in the sky. It's, you know what I mean? This is a set of coordinates, a set of waypoints that are put into a flight computer, an autopilot basically, and the autopilot does its best to navigate between set radio waypoints. And what tends to happen is that planes that are following an identical flight path tend to be put on sort of 30-second gap, which is about 5 miles, 5 nautical miles, 30 seconds to a minute, I think. And will follow each other down the sort of flight pipe, one after the other, going into or out of whatever zone it is that they're flying into or out of. And as a consequence, their distance, their altitude, their spacing can all be known pretty accurately. So other flight paths may cross over and directly intersect them at 90 degrees, but these will be at a completely different altitude. Yeah, and so you can see how these grid patterns, these crisscross patterns, can happen with just a small amount of drift between the sort of lateral, the left and right positioning of each of the planes at that height is going to give you repeated sets of stripes going across the sky one way, and repeated sets of stripes maybe being laid by another flight path intersecting with that at some point there. And, you know what I mean? A lot of these, once you're out of the actual dedicated flight paths, then you get into the realms where the pilots have some autonomy over where they're going to fly their planes, but of course they all choose exactly the same routes because that's the optimized route. So, so even outside of the actual specified flight paths, you'll still see planes adhering to a more or less sort of canal-like path. And the other thing that was mentioned in the chat was orgone. You see, we have Sibes, the Orgonite maker. I still don't know whether I actually approve of Orgonite. Yes, your original tit that I have kept all these years and has... Is it a mushroom? Oh, sorry, I just thought it was like a Playtex booby. It's like a turd-coloured Playtex booby with stuff embedded in it. But funnily enough, that has been in the room with every single one of my radio broadcasts. So all of my radio broadcasts are officially Sibes orgone powered. If you believe in that shit. Anyway, here's kind of how my week's been anyway. Roxy Music, both ends burning.